The deserts of Iran whisper of an empire once so vast, so powerful, that its very shadow stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the banks of the Indus, from the lush valleys of Egypt to the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia. Yet when we imagine Persia, we are often torn between legend and history, between the grandeur of kings cloaked in gold and the soldiers who marched beneath their banners, between the myths of divine favor and the stark realities of conquest and defeat. What if we tried to trace the story from the beginning, not as scattered fragments, but as a single, sweeping epic of power, ambition, and fate? What if we tried to witness the rise and fall of the Persian Empire not as a distant past, but as a living drama unfolding before us? Long before Persia became the largest empire the world had ever seen, it was but one of many small kingdoms scattered across the Iranian plateau. The rugged mountains and arid plains of this land shaped a people hardened by struggle, who valued loyalty, horsemanship, and endurance. In those ancient days, the Persians were overshadowed by the Medes, their cousins to the north, who had already built a powerful state after shaking free of Assyrian dominance. The Medes had once joined with the Babylonians to bring down the great Assyrian Empire, toppling Nineveh in 612 BCE, an act that seemed to shift the balance of the ancient world forever. Yet even in the shadows of the Medes, the Persians stirred, guided by a lineage of kings who claimed descent from Achaemenes, a semi-legendary ancestor whose name would one day give rise to the dynasty known as the Achaemenids. From this backdrop emerged Cyrus, the man who would forever alter history. His story was wrapped in myth from the very beginning. Ancient accounts claim that his grandfather, the Median king Astyages, had a dream foretelling that Cyrus would one day overthrow him. Attempting to defy fate, Astyages ordered the infant's death. But the child was spared and raised in obscurity, his identity hidden until the appointed time. Like so many great conquerors, his survival was cast as divine will, as though the gods themselves had chosen him to rule. When he finally rose in rebellion, it was not merely a contest of armies, but the fulfillment of prophecy. Against all odds, he defeated Astyages in 550 BCE, uniting the Persians and the Medes into one kingdom under his command. What followed was not simply expansion, it was transformation. Cyrus understood something few rulers of his age did. Empires were not maintained by fear alone, nor by plunder and conquest. If he was to hold together the vast and diverse lands he sought to rule, he needed more than armies. He needed legitimacy. Thus began one of the most remarkable careers of conquest in history. First, he struck westward, defeating the wealthy and powerful kingdom of Lydia, whose king Croesus was said to possess immeasurable riches. Croesus, confident in his fortune and the protection of his gods, had once consulted the oracle of Delphi, asking whether he should go to war with Cyrus. The answer he received, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall," proved tragically ambiguous. Croesus assumed it meant Persia's empire. But when his armies were defeated and his capital at Sardis captured, it was Lydia's empire that crumbled. Cyrus then turned eastward, subduing the lands of Central Asia, and then south toward Babylon, the fabled city of Mesopotamia. In 539 BCE, he marched on the great metropolis, whose walls were said to be impregnable. Yet Cyrus did not rely on brute force. Instead, he exploited the Euphrates River itself, diverting its waters so his soldiers could march under the walls through the dry riverbed. Babylon fell, and Cyrus entered not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, often regarded as the world's first charter of human rights, proclaims his respect for local customs, religions, and traditions. He allowed exiled peoples to return to their homelands, including the Jews who had been taken into captivity by the Babylonians. By doing so, he crafted an image not only of a conqueror, but of a just ruler, chosen by the gods of many nations. In this way, the Persian Empire became something unprecedented. Unlike the Assyrians, who had ruled through terror and deportation, or the Babylonians, who had relied on ancient prestige, the Persians built an empire of tolerance and integration. Peoples of different faiths and languages could live under the same rule, so long as they acknowledged the authority of the great king. Tribute flowed in, soldiers were recruited from across the lands, and the empire expanded yet further. By the end of Cyrus's reign, Persia stretched from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the edges of India, from the mountains of Central Asia to the deserts of Arabia. It was, for its time, the greatest empire the world had ever known. But empires are fragile, even in their glory. Cyrus met his end in battle against the Massagetæ, a nomadic people of the steppe. According to Herodotus, he was slain by their queen Tomyris, who, in revenge for her son's death, plunged Cyrus's head into a skin filled with blood, declaring that he had at last drunk his fill. Whether legend or fact, his death was sudden, and the throne passed to his son Cambyses. Cambyses inherited not only his father's empire, but also his ambition. He turned his gaze toward Egypt, the last great power of the ancient Near East, still standing outside Persian rule. In 525 BCE, he led his armies across the Sinai Desert, defeating the Egyptians at the Battle of Pelusium. Herodotus, ever eager for dramatic detail, claims that the Persians placed cats and other sacred animals before their ranks, knowing the Egyptians would not dare to harm them. Whether this was true or not, Egypt fell, and Cambyses added the land of the pharaohs to the Persian crown. For the first time, a single empire stretched seamlessly from the Nile to the Indus, encompassing an astonishing array of peoples, cultures, and religions. Yet Cambyses proved less wise than his father. Tales of his cruelty and madness circulated widely, whether exaggerated by Greek storytellers or based in truth. He desecrated Egyptian temples, mocked their gods, and grew increasingly paranoid. His rule ended abruptly when he died in Syria under mysterious circumstances, leaving the empire in turmoil. Into this vacuum stepped Darius, a distant relative of Cyrus, who seized the throne after quelling widespread revolts. It was Darius who would truly shape the empire into a lasting power, one that could endure beyond the charisma of a single conqueror. Darius understood administration. He knew that the vast empire needed order, not chaos. He divided the lands into satrapies, provinces each governed by a satrap responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining justice, and raising troops. He instituted standardized coinage, improved trade routes, and embarked on monumental building projects. Among these was the creation of a new capital, Persepolis, a city of breathtaking splendor meant to embody the glory of Persia itself. Stone reliefs depict envoys from every corner of the empire bringing gifts to the king, symbolizing both the diversity and unity of his realm. But even as he consolidated power at home, Darius faced challenges abroad. To the west lay Greece, a land of fiercely independent city-states, fractious and small compared to Persia, yet proud of their freedom. When the Ionian Greeks in Asia Minor revolted against Persian rule, Darius vowed to punish those who aided them. This would spark the great conflict between Persia and Greece, a clash that would echo through history. His first invasion ended in defeat at Marathon in 490 BCE, a stunning victory for the Athenians against overwhelming odds. Darius died before he could return, but his son Xerxes would carry the torch of war. Xerxes' invasion of Greece remains one of the most dramatic campaigns in history. With a massive army and fleet, he sought to crush the Greeks once and for all. The tales of Thermopylae, where King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans made their legendary stand, and of Salamis, where the Greek fleet outmaneuvered the Persians, have become immortal. Xerxes' defeat marked the beginning of Persia's long struggle against the rising power of Greece. Yet even in defeat, the Persian Empire endured. Its wealth, its culture, and its administrative genius allowed it to remain the preeminent power of the ancient Near East for nearly 2 more centuries. It weathered revolts, wars, and palace intrigues. Kings rose and fell, but the empire remained, its grandeur undimmed, until the arrival of a new conqueror from the west, Alexander of Macedon, whose lightning campaigns would bring the Persian Empire to its knees. The failure of Xerxes' grand campaign against Greece did not spell the end of Persia's greatness, though to the Greeks it became the very symbol of hubris, the arrogance of a king who believed the world could be bent to his will. In truth, while Greece celebrated victories at Salamis and Plataea, the empire remained intact, its core unshaken. For the Persians, Greece was a distant frontier, troublesome perhaps, but hardly the center of their world. From the vantage point of Persepolis, Susa, or Babylon, the empire was still vast and wealthy, its provinces still loyal, its systems still functioning. The Persians had lost battles, but the empire endured. Xerxes returned to his palaces, and his court became the stage for intrigue, opulence, and ambition. Greek sources delight in telling stories of his cruelty and decadence, but archaeology and Persian inscriptions reveal another image, that of a ruler still invested in grand building projects, still presenting himself as the King of Kings, chosen by Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of the Zoroastrian faith. The religion of Persia, though never imposed by force, increasingly shaped the identity of its rulers. Zoroastrianism taught of a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, and the king's duty was to uphold order against chaos. Xerxes and his successors invoked this divine mission, casting themselves not merely as conquerors, but as guardians of universal harmony. Yet beneath the grandeur lay instability. The satrapal system that Darius had perfected was both a strength and a weakness. By granting immense power to provincial governors, the empire could function across enormous distances, but it also created opportunities for rebellion. Satraps commanded their own armies, collected taxes, and at times acted with near-royal authority. Xerxes faced revolts in Egypt and Babylon, both of which he suppressed, but the precedent was clear. Maintaining the empire required constant vigilance. After Xerxes' assassination in 465 BCE, the throne passed through the hands of his son, Artaxerxes I, who ruled for 4 decades. His reign illustrates the resilience of Persian administration. Despite challenges, he maintained stability, oversaw rebuilding projects, and continued to balance the many cultures within his empire. Yet it was also under his reign that Persia's conflict with Greece lingered on, flaring into skirmishes along the Aegean. The Delian League, led by Athens, clashed repeatedly with Persian forces in the eastern Mediterranean. Though the Greeks boasted of victories, Persia was never decisively weakened. The so-called Peace of Callias, around 449 BCE, may have formalized an uneasy truce, but Persia remained the greater power. What fascinates historians is how Persia could absorb defeat without crumbling. Where Greek city-states often fractured after setbacks, Persia, with its administrative depth and immense wealth, could weather storms. Tribute continued to flow into the royal treasuries. Roads connected the empire from Sardis to Susa, allowing for the rapid movement of messengers and goods. The royal road, stretching over 2,500 kilometers, was patrolled and maintained, its stations supplying fresh horses for couriers. In this way, information that might have taken weeks elsewhere could reach the king within days. It was not brute force, but organization that sustained Persia's empire. Artaxerxes was succeeded by his son Xerxes II, whose reign was brief and ended in assassination, ushering in a period of dynastic struggle. From this turmoil emerged Darius II, whose reign is often remembered as one of decline. Corruption among satraps grew, revolts flared, and the Greeks once again drew Persian attention. particularly as the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta consumed the Aegean world. Persia, ever pragmatic, intervened by funding Sparta against Athens, tipping the balance of power. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy. With minimal effort, Persia weakened its old enemy Athens, reasserting influence over the Greek world without launching a costly invasion. When Darius II died, his son ascended as Artaxerxes II, ruling longer than any other Achaemenid king. His reign, however, was overshadowed by internal strife. His younger brother Cyrus the Younger rebelled against him, drawing to his side thousands of Greek mercenaries. At the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BCE, Cyrus was killed, but his Greek soldiers, known as the 10,000, managed a remarkable retreat northward through Persian lands back to Greece. This event, chronicled by Xenophon, gave the Greeks a new vision of Persia, not as invincible but as vulnerable, its vastness concealing weaknesses that a disciplined army might exploit. Artaxerxes II nevertheless proved resilient. He ruled for over 40 years, putting down revolts and continuing monumental building at Persepolis. He invested in diplomacy, manipulating Greek politics by funding different city-states at different times, ensuring no single Greek power could rise unchecked. Yet beneath the surface, cracks widened. Egypt slipped from Persian control, regaining independence. The satraps, ever ambitious, plotted their own rebellions, testing the authority of the great king. The next ruler, Artaxerxes III, recognized the danger of fragmentation and acted ruthlessly. He suppressed the satraps' revolts with iron determination and reconquered Egypt, reasserting Persian dominance. For a moment it seemed the empire might revive its old strength. But his death, by poisoning, unleashed chaos at court once more. His successor, Artaxerxes IV, reigned only briefly before also being murdered, leaving the throne to Darius III, the last of the Achaemenid kings. By this time, Persia was still vast and wealthy, but its ruling dynasty was deeply fractured. Court intrigues, assassinations, and betrayal had weakened the monarchy. Satraps acted with increasing independence, and revolts continued to trouble the empire. Yet perhaps most ominously, a new power was rising in the west. In Macedonia, a once marginal kingdom, Philip II had united his people and created a professional army unlike any the Greeks had seen before. Upon his assassination, his son Alexander inherited not only this army, but also his father's vision of conquest. Before Alexander set his sights on Persia, Darius III faced challenges even within his own realm. Satraps in Asia Minor grew restive, and Egypt once again stirred with dreams of independence. Darius attempted to strengthen his rule, but unlike Cyrus or Darius the Great, he lacked both charisma and control. His court was riddled with conspiracies, and his authority was constantly undermined. When Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, the Persians may have underestimated him. After all, the empire had faced Greek incursions before and survived. At the Battle of the Granicus, Persian satraps fell, but the empire still seemed strong. Yet the pattern had shifted. Alexander moved quickly, decisively, and with relentless momentum. At Issus in 333 BCE, Darius himself faced Alexander, but was forced to flee, leaving behind his family. This humiliation undermined his authority further, as kings of kings were not meant to flee before an enemy. Still, the empire was not yet lost. Its resources were immense, its armies vast. But Alexander understood what the Greeks had learned at Cunaxa, that Persia's strength lay not in its soldiers' courage, but in its sheer scale, and that once its leadership faltered, the whole could unravel. He pushed deeper, seizing the wealth of Babylon and Susa, then turning toward Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire. When his soldiers set it aflame, whether by drunken impulse or deliberate symbol, they destroyed more than a palace. They destroyed the very image of Persian greatness. Darius III fled eastward, attempting to raise new armies, but his own satraps betrayed him. In 330 BCE, he was captured and killed, not by Alexander, but by his own men, who hoped to win favor with the conqueror. Instead, Alexander honored Darius with a royal burial, presenting himself not as a destroyer, but as the rightful heir of the Achaemenids. With Darius's death, the Achaemenid dynasty came to an end. Persia, which had once ruled the known world, now bowed before the Macedonian king. Yet in its fall, it left behind a legacy that would endure for centuries. The very idea of empire, of ruling through tolerance and administration rather than mere conquest, had been perfected by the Persians. Alexander adopted Persian dress, Persian court rituals, even Persian governors, blending Macedonian and Persian traditions into something new. Later empires, from the Seleucids to the Romans, from the Parthians to the Sassanians, would all inherit something of Persia's model. The story of the Persian Empire does not end with its conquest by Alexander. It reverberates through history, a reminder of both the heights of human ambition and the fragility of power. Its kings dreamed of ruling the world, and for a time they nearly succeeded. But even the greatest empires are mortal, bound by the same cycles of rise and fall as the men who build them. Persia's story, like the fire at Persepolis, burned bright, then faded, yet its embers continued to glow in the civilizations that followed. What made Persia unique was not only the reach of its armies or the splendor of its palaces, but the unseen threads that bound together so many peoples into one empire. To truly understand the greatness of the Persians, one must step into their world beyond the battlefield, into the avenues of Persepolis, the caravans crossing the deserts, the satraps in their distant courts, and the temples where priests invoked the divine fire of Ahura Mazda. The very idea of the Achaemenid king was extraordinary. He was not a mere monarch ruling by blood and conquest. He was the Shahanshah, the king of kings, a ruler whose authority stretched across countless nations. From the Greek Ionian cities on the Aegean coast to the Indus Valley far in the east, from the oases of Arabia to the fertile Nile, kings, chiefs, and governors all acknowledged his supremacy. In art and inscription, the king stood as a mediator between heaven and earth, chosen by Ahura Mazda to uphold order in the world. This was not mere propaganda, it was a sacred duty. The empire's administration reflected this balance between absolute authority and practical governance. Satraps, appointed by the king, governed provinces with wide autonomy, collecting taxes, enforcing justice, and maintaining armies. But no satrap was free from oversight. The king's eye, royal inspectors, traveled the empire, reporting directly back to the throne. This network of accountability helped prevent rebellion, though it could not eliminate ambition and intrigue altogether. Still, it was a system centuries ahead of its time, enabling Persia to manage territories so far apart they seemed to belong to different worlds. Travel across these vast lands was made possible by one of the empire's greatest innovations, the royal road. Stretching from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Elam, this artery of empire spanned nearly 2,700 kilometers. Relay stations with fresh horses ensured messages could travel the distance in mere days rather than months. Herodotus marveled at the couriers, declaring that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stopped them, a phrase later echoed in modern postal service mottos. Alongside roads, canals were dug to connect rivers, and great bridges were built to span impossible distances, feats of engineering that testified to the empire's mastery of logistics. But logistics alone did not hold such diversity together. At the core of Persia's endurance was its remarkable policy of tolerance. Unlike the Assyrians, who had ruled by fear, or the Babylonians, who exalted their own gods above all others, The Persians allowed conquered peoples to retain their religions, customs, and languages. Egyptians worshipped in their temples, Jews returned to Jerusalem, Babylonians honored Marduk, Greeks sacrificed to their gods, all under the umbrella of Persian rule. This approach was not idealism, but pragmatism. By respecting traditions, the Persians minimized resistance and fostered loyalty. It was empire not by erasure, but by inclusion. Zoroastrianism, though never enforced as a state religion in the way later empires would impose faith, nevertheless shaped the ethos of Persian rule. Its vision of a cosmic struggle between order and chaos, truth and lie, infused royal ideology. Kings invoked Ahura Mazda in their inscriptions, swearing that their authority came not by chance, but by divine appointment. The fire temples scattered across the empire, with their eternal flames tended by priests, became symbols of this divine presence. Yet the Persians never demanded that Egyptians abandon their gods, or that Greeks forsake Zeus. Instead, the king stood above them all, sanctioned by the highest truth, but tolerant of many paths. The wealth of the empire astonished all who encountered it. Tribute flowed from every corner: gold from Lydia, silver from Egypt, lapis lazuli from Bactria, ivory from India, spices from Arabia, horses from Media, and grain from Mesopotamia. Persepolis was the ceremonial treasury of these riches, its halls lined with the tributes of the known world. Reliefs carved into stone depict delegations from across the empire: Scythians in tall caps, Ethiopians carrying ivory, Indians bringing exotic animals, all filing toward the king in solemn procession. These were not mere decorations, but statements of power, monuments in stone to the unity of diversity under Persian rule. Persian art and architecture carried a unique blend of traditions. At Persepolis, columns rose like forests of stone, capped with double-headed bulls, lions, and griffins, merging Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and local Iranian motifs into something distinctively Persian. The palaces were not only residences but theaters of empire, designed to impress visiting envoys with their scale and magnificence. In their reliefs, Persians are not depicted in scenes of conquest or violence, but in harmony and procession, as though the empire's strength lay not in destruction, but in order. This emphasis on harmony reflected the Zoroastrian ethos of balance, even as Persian armies remained capable of overwhelming force. The society that lived under Persian rule was equally complex. At its heart were the Persians themselves, a warrior aristocracy who held privileged positions within the empire. But alongside them lived Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, Indians, and countless others. Multilingualism was the norm. Aramaic became the lingua franca of administration, uniting scribes and merchants across thousands of miles. Trade flourished along the empire's arteries, carrying not just goods, but ideas. From Babylonian astronomy to Egyptian medicine, from Greek philosophy to Indian mathematics, knowledge passed along Persian roads as freely as tribute. The empire became a crucible where cultures met and influenced one another. Persian women, too, played notable roles, though less often recorded in the triumphal inscriptions. Royal women such as Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus and wife of Darius, wielded significant influence at court. Documents from Persepolis reveal that women could own property, receive rations, and manage estates. In a world where many societies limited women's roles to the domestic sphere, Persia offered at least some avenues for visibility and authority. Yet for all its grandeur, the empire was not without suffering. Heavy taxation weighed on peasants who worked the fields to feed armies and fill treasuries. Military levies pulled men from their homes, sending them to fight in distant lands they might never see again. Revolts were punished harshly, as in Babylon when Xerxes crushed resistance and desecrated temples. Though tolerant in policy, the empire could be merciless when challenged. The harmony it projected in stone reliefs was real, but it was sustained by the iron reality of power. Perhaps what most distinguished Persia was the image it projected to outsiders. To the Greeks, Persia was both terrifying and alluring. They mocked Persian luxury, describing kings reclining on golden couches perfumed with incense and waited upon by eunuchs. Yet they also admired Persian discipline, their engineering, and their reach. To resist Persia became for the Greeks a way of defining themselves. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, these battles became legends precisely because Persia loomed so large. In a sense, the Persians created the Greeks as much as the Greeks opposed them, forcing the small, fractious city-states to forge a shared identity in contrast to the empire's might. Even after Alexander conquered Persia, the legacy of the Achaemenids endured. The Seleucid kings who followed adopted Persian court rituals. The Parthians revived Persian traditions while blending them with Hellenistic forms. The Sassanians, centuries later, would explicitly claim descent from the Achaemenids, styling themselves as the true heirs of Cyrus and Darius. Even Rome, the empire that would one day battle Persia for centuries, borrowed ideas from its administration. In this way, Persia's vision of empire, multicultural, centralized yet tolerant, rich in symbolism and ceremony, became a template for the future. And beyond empires, Persia lived on in memory and myth. To the Jews, Cyrus was the anointed liberator who freed them from Babylonian captivity. To the Greeks, Persia was the eternal adversary, the vast Eastern empire that defined the boundaries of the West. To later Persians, the Achaemenids were the Golden Age, a source of pride and identity that outlived conquest. The stones of Persepolis, blackened by Alexander's fire, still stood as a reminder that though empires fall, their echoes never die. It is tempting to see Persia only through the lens of its end, to imagine that Alexander's victories erased it. But the truth is more complex. Alexander did not destroy Persia so much as absorb it, wearing its garments, marrying its princesses, and adopting its customs. His own empire, short-lived though it was in many ways a continuation of the Persian experiment. When his successors divided his realm, Persia's lands remained central, coveted for their wealth and strategic position. The empire that Cyrus had forged did not vanish with Darius III. It transformed, leaving behind a heritage that shaped centuries of history. Thus, when we look back at the Persian Empire, we do not see only conquest and collapse. We see a civilization that pioneered ideas of governance, tolerance, and infrastructure that still resonate. We see a people who dreamed of unity across diversity, who imagined an empire not of one nation crushing others, but of many nations under one king. Their story is not just the story of battles and kings, but of roads and scribes, priests and merchants, farmers and artisans, all bound together in one of humanity's first great experiments in global rule. When Alexander stood over the smoldering ruins of Persepolis, he may have believed that the empire of the Persians was finished, that its power and majesty had been reduced to ashes. Yet history has a way of preserving what fire cannot consume. The Achaemenid dynasty had fallen, but the idea of Persia, its traditions, its culture, its vision of empire, was far from extinguished. Even in defeat, Persia's story was only beginning a new chapter. Alexander tried to bridge worlds by adopting Persian customs, marrying into the royal family, and training his Macedonians to bow in the Persian style. But his sudden death in 323 BCE fractured his empire, leaving his generals to carve up the spoils. The lands of Persia fell under the Seleucids, one of the great successor kingdoms. On the surface, Greek rulers now governed from cities like Seleucia and Antioch, but beneath the veneer of Hellenism, Persian traditions endured. Local nobility remained powerful. Temples continued to honor Ahura Mazda, and the rhythms of life in the satrapies changed little. Yet the Seleucids, for all their ambitions, never fully mastered the lands of Iran. Their power was concentrated in the west, near the Mediterranean, and the heartlands of Persia became restless. Out of this discontent rose a new dynasty, the Parthians, a people from the northeastern steppes of Iran. Hardy horsemen, masters of mounted archery, they struck like lightning, challenging Seleucid control. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Parthians had carved out their own empire, reviving Persian independence under a new banner. The Parthian Empire was very different from the Achaemenid vision. Where the Achaemenids centralized power in Persepolis and Susa, the Parthians ruled more loosely, relying on a feudal network of noble families. Their kings bore the title King of Kings, echoing the Achaemenids. But they were often constrained by the great clans who provided cavalry for their armies. Their strength lay in the field, in the speed and mobility of their horse archers. Roman legions accustomed to heavy infantry warfare found themselves humbled at Carrhae in 53 BCE, where Parthian arrows and cavalry tactics annihilated the army of Crassus. In this way, Persia once again emerged as the great rival of the West, confronting Rome much as the Achaemenids had once confronted Greece. For nearly 5 centuries, the Parthians and Romans wrestled for dominance across Mesopotamia, Syria, and Armenia. Neither side could claim lasting supremacy. Persian cavalry clashed with Roman legions again and again, with cities changing hands only to be retaken years later. Yet through it all, Persia endured, a reminder that empires might rise and fall in the Mediterranean. But in the Iranian plateau, the legacy of Cyrus still lived on. The Parthians, however, were not eternal. Their decentralized system, while resilient, was also vulnerable to internal division. By the early 3rd century CE, a new dynasty arose in Fars, the very heartland of ancient Persia. Ardashir, a local ruler, overthrew the last Parthian king and declared the foundation of a new Persian empire, the Sasanian dynasty. In their own eyes, they were not innovators but restorers, reviving the glory of the Achaemenids after centuries of foreign rule. The Sassanians embraced Zoroastrianism more fully than their predecessors, making it the state religion and binding church and crown in mutual support. Fire temples blazed across the empire, and priests became powerful figures in court and society. The Sassanians depicted themselves as divine rulers, heirs to Darius and Xerxes, chosen by Ahura Mazda to guard the world against chaos. Their art and architecture drew from Achaemenid models, but with new vigor. Monumental palaces rising at Ctesiphon and Bishapur, adorned with reliefs of kings trampling their enemies beneath the hooves of their horses. Under the Sassanians, Persia became Rome's most formidable rival. From the Euphrates to the Caucasus, from Egypt to Anatolia, the two superpowers collided in wars that seemed endless. Cities were sacked, emperors captured, frontiers shifted, yet neither side could destroy the other. When Rome fell in the west, it was Persia that remained, its empire stretching proudly into the New Age. For centuries, the contest between Rome and Persia defined the ancient world, a duel of equals unmatched until much later in history. But even great rivals fall. In the 7th century, the Sassanians, exhausted by wars with Byzantium and weakened by internal strife, faced a new force rising from the Arabian deserts. The armies of Islam swept through Persia with astonishing speed. The old order crumbled, the Zoroastrian priesthood fell, and the fire temples dimmed. Yet even here, Persia did not vanish. Under Islamic rule, Persian culture adapted and flourished, its language, literature, and traditions reshaping the Islamic Golden Age. From poetry to philosophy, from science to art, Persia remained a beacon, proving that empires may die, but civilizations endure. Looking back across this vast sweep of history, the Persian Empire appears less as a single entity and more as a thread woven through centuries, binding together successive dynasties, foreign conquerors, and rival civilizations. The Achaemenids built the first great model of empire, multicultural, tolerant, efficient, ambitious. The Parthians carried the flame, defying Rome with the power of the steppe. The Sassanians revived the ancient grandeur, elevating Zoroastrianism to its height and pushing Persia into a final showdown with Byzantium. And even after the Arab conquest, Persia lived on, not in palaces or armies, but in words, art, and memory. The story of Persia is a story of resilience. Few lands have witnessed so many conquests, and yet few have left so indelible a mark upon the world. From the vision of Cyrus the Great, who saw empire not as domination but as stewardship, to the grandeur of Persepolis, where envoys of every nation filed before the king, Persia shaped what empire could mean. Its roads carried not only tribute, but ideas. Its kings ruled not only with swords, but with symbols. Its legacy stretched across continents, influencing Rome, Byzantium, Islam, and even modern notions of governance. And perhaps this is the truest measure of Persia's greatness. Not merely the battles it won or lost, nor the cities it built or burned, but the idea that peoples of different faiths and tongues could live under one rule, bound by law and respect rather than annihilation. In an age when empires rose and fell in violence, Persia dared to imagine something larger, something more enduring. Today, when we stand among the ruins of Persepolis, the carved processions of tribute-bearers still marching silently across the stone, we are reminded that empire is both fragile and eternal. The palaces have crumbled, the kings are dust, but the vision remains, of a world once united under a single crown, of a civilization that shaped the course of history. The Persian Empire was not the first, nor would it be the last. But in its rise and fall, in its grandeur and its tragedy, it captured the eternal rhythm of human ambition. Power won through struggle, sustained through vision, and lost through fate. Its echoes still reverberate in the stones, in the stories, and in the enduring idea that from the deserts of Iran once rose an empire that sought to hold the world in balance. And so the story of Persia ends not with fire or conquest, but with legacy, with the enduring memory of a people who dreamed on a scale few have ever matched. For in the end, the Persian Empire is not simply history. It is a mirror reflecting our own search for order, unity, and meaning in the vastness of human time.